Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Graphics Card Performance Comparison. Today we are testing 4 different graphics cards, the GTX 670, 770, 970, and 1070. You can see all 4 of them at the same time. I'm doing something new. Each of these were tested at 1080p resolution full HD, but I'm rendering and uploading this video at 4K. Since 4K resolution is exactly 4 times 1080p, I can upload these in a square format. i7 7700K, 5 GHz fixed, 16 gigs of RAM, DDR4 3200 MHz, and as I said, these are tested at 1080p resolution. In the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you will see the GTX 670. In the upper right-hand corner, you will see the 770. In the bottom left-hand corner, the 970, and the bottom right-hand corner is the GTX 1070. I do have them labeled on the MSI Afterburner numbers to make it easier to see which is which. Now, a couple of important points to make. Because we are testing this today at ultra detail, we do run into a VRAM limitation on the 670 and 770. It is true that if I ran those at high or medium or just turned down the textures, they would not run out of VRAM and performance would be a little bit better on those cards. On the other hand, running at anything less than ultra detail on the 970 and 1070 would be pointless. Both the 970 and 1070 are so fast at 1080p resolution, anything less than ultra detail simply won't do. That is frankly one of the challenges when trying to test the same games on 4 different generations of graphics cards. What resolution and what detail setting do you pick? Because while I could turn the game down to run better on a 670 or a 770, it would then be massive overkill on the 1070 or even 970. If on the other hand I set the resolution to 1440p ultra detail, the 770 and 670 simply wouldn't function at all. So where do we go? Somewhere in the middle, ultra detail 1080p. If you look at the first line of each graphics card, the first percentage there is the GPU usage, the percentage of the compute power of the card. Notice that all 4 cards are basically at 99% usage, so we are basically graphics card limited on all 4 cards. With more graphics performance, we could play this game even faster. The next number is the temperature. Now these are different cards from different generations, so the temperatures are not directly comparable. Furthermore, the first card, the 670, is a blower style. It's the only 670 I have, and it is a traditional reference blower style with a single fan. The other cards, the 770 is a 2-fan EVGA superclocked, and then the 970 and 1070 are both EVGA for the win cards, both with 2 fans each. That is why the 770, 970, and 1070 are cooler in temperature, and that 670 is running very, very hot. That, and it's an older card, older production design, and of course it's blower, so they do tend to run warmer. On the other hand, it has played every game I've tested just fine, even at high temperatures, so while it's warm, well, fair enough, it does in fact run just fine. Notice the fan speed. That is where blower cards got a poor reputation, and I really should do a old versus new blower card because that is running at almost 3,500 RPM at very high temperatures. But modern blower cards do not. I've commented in other videos that if you go out and buy a 1070 reference card or Founders Edition with the blower style cooler, it's really not that bad. In fact, the computer that I'm recording this voiceover on has a 1080 Ti Founders Edition reference blower card in it, and it does not make any noise at all. It's very, very quiet. So there is a difference between the older style blower cards and the new ones. Now you can see the clock speed of each of the cards at the end of the first line. None of these cards has been manually overclocked. The tremendous clock speed on the 1070 is due to NVIDIA's GPU boost. That's their auto overclocking at work. I did not set that 1987 MHz manually. That is the EVGA for the win using NVIDIA's GPU boost to auto overclock. Now the older cards will overclock manually, but I have not done so. That 770 specifically would definitely go up probably 250 megahertz if I wanted to, but since most people do not overclock their graphics cards manually, I run them in the out-of-the-box configuration. Now bring your attention down to line 2 of the MSI real-time numbers. The top 2 cards each have 2 gigabytes of VRAM. The bottom 2 cards have 4 and 8 gigabytes respectively. There are 4GB versions of the GTX 770. They were rare, but they did exist. Mine is a 2GB card. The reason I bring this to your attention is at 1080p, Battlefield 1 will use more than 2GB of VRAM. Notice that it is in fact playable on the older cards, but the frame rate suffers and the main system RAM usage is higher because the graphics cards are actually falling over to main system RAM usage in order to hold the extra texture detail, but this does slow those cards down. You would get slightly higher frame rates on the older cards if you lowered the texture detail down low enough to just use the 2GB of VRAM, or if you had a 4GB GTX 770. You can see the clock speeds of the VRAM on each of the cards there as well. Coming down to line 3, we have our i7 7700K CPU. As I said, this is running at 5 GHz. Notice this chip is running fairly warm on all of these machines. We are over 80 degrees, up to 90 degrees in some situations. I don't have a large enough cooler on this chip to run at 5 GHz. It really runs better at 4.8. I will be doing an upcoming video showing the installation of a larger 280mm liquid cooler on this, and I will do a before and after comparison, but I fully expect to get 10, maybe 15 degrees cooler temperature and a much better experience running at 5 GHz on the i7 7700K. Now a quick note about the CPUs. On the 670, 770, and 970, whether you have an i7 7700K or a Ryzen 5 1500X or even an i7 2600K would make no difference to the performance. It's only at 1080p on the GTX 1070 where it would make a difference. Look right now, we are between, there's 77% CPU usage on this 1070. Why is that? That is what's allowing us to get to 150 frames per second. If you are interested in playing at 144 to 165 frames per second, if you have a 144 Hz 1080p monitor, a i7 7700K overclocked to 5 GHz will provide you with that frame rate in most situations if you have enough graphics card. The older CPUs, the slower CPUs, an i7 at 4 GHz instead of 5 would struggle with it. A Ryzen 5 1500X at 4 GHz would not produce 150 frames per second. It would produce 100 without any issues whatsoever, and probably 120 in many situations. But if you are in fact interested in 150 frames per second, it's i7 7700K at 5 GHz or bust. I just think it's worth pointing that detail out because I've done these type of comparisons before, but I did them on the Ryzen 7 1700X at 4 GHz, and one of the comments a number of people made was, why are you doing this on Ryzen? i7 gives higher frame rates. Well, yes it does, but unless you have a 144 Hz monitor, it doesn't matter, and unless you are playing at lower resolutions with high-end graphics cards, it also doesn't matter. Anything up to 100, maybe 120 frames per second, it really doesn't matter so much about your CPU. Anything in the 3.5 to 4 GHz range is usually plenty. But if you're looking for that 144 to 165 Hz, the 4.5 to 5 GHz and the latest and greatest i7s from Intel really do make a difference for that extremely high frame rate. Moving down to line 4, let's look at our main system RAM. Now we have 16 gigabytes of RAM in this system. First, let me be clear, there's nothing else running on this computer. I am not capturing this video on the computer that's being done externally. This is a test computer. It's very, very clean. Look at the main system RAM usage between the various machines. Notice that the GTX 1070 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM is using less main system RAM than the other cards are. We're using a bit more on the GTX 970 and lots more on the 770 and 670. That's because those cards at some point start running out of VRAM. Yes, I know the GTX 970 has 4 gigs or 3.5 depending upon how you want to look at it. That's a story for another time. But definitely on the 670 and 770 you see the main system RAM usage is higher. Some of the texture information, some of the game information has to be stored in main system RAM. On the 1070 you can see we are a full gigabyte, actually more than that, less than the lower end cards. Look at that 670. Now the maps are different to be sure, and the textures and the details on the maps will in fact be slightly different. But when a game runs out of VRAM, it will fall over and use main system RAM, and that's part of the reason why there's more RAM being used on the other cards. Now finally, that brings us to line 5, the real-time frame rate. We're currently at 34, 33 frames per second on the GTX 670. Should you really play Battlefield 1 at ultra detail on a GTX 670? No, of course not. But let me be clear, it is faster and it is better if you turn the detail down. Where's the sweet spot? Medium. Low detail is actually pretty ugly. You give up a lot to get down to low. High still isn't going to get 60 frames per second, but medium will get close. If you have a 4-year-old or older GTX 670 and you want to play Battlefield 1, yes you can. Set it to medium or set it to high. Maybe make 1 or 2 minor adjustments to the settings manually if you don't want to take the presets. Let me make one further point. Even though Battlefield 1 is running at barely 30 frames per second, it was completely playable. I did not have a problem playing the game. Now, ignoring the fact that my skills are pretty bad, let me just be absolutely clear that the game was playable. It was controllable. 60 frames per second is ideal, but not required to play games. Now, is the 130 to 150 frames per second on the GTX 1070 in the bottom right corner better? Sure, absolutely. However, it was playable on all 4 cards, even at ultra detail. Now, you're going to be more competitive and you're going to be better at it if you're getting 60 frames per second. This is, after all, a competitive online multiplayer game. But it's worth noting you don't have to go out and buy the latest and greatest graphics card just to play the latest and greatest games. Make a small compromise on detail and you'll get close to 60 frames per second on that GTX 670 without a problem. One final point that I would like to make before we jump to the benchmark results screen. These are different maps, different matches, different plays. I died different amounts of times. I was in different areas doing different things. The results here are representative of the cards, but not directly comparable. You cannot take these numbers as gospel. I could rerun this test on each of these cards 5 times and I would get 5 different results. They're going to vary by a few frames per second on each run, both with the minimums and with the averages. It is an online game. What's going on is different in every run. So consider this a general idea of the performance of these cards and not an absolute. These results are not perfectly repeatable from run to run. To get them perfectly repeatable would take more time than frankly it's worth. This is simply representing average differences in performance between generations of cards. Finally, I realize that some people may say, well, play the single player game. You can pick a match, you can do the same basic things in each match. They'll be relatively repeatable because the AI does the same thing and you're not dealing with different maps and online players. While that's true, the single player game is not nearly as stressful as the multiplayer game. Getting into a 64 player online multiplayer match takes far more computer power than just playing the single player game. Furthermore, once a game has been out for a few months, I think far more people who are still interested in the game are playing the online version of it, not the single player. So what you see here is the challenging stuff. If you want to play the single player game, by all means, it'll play fine on any of these at some given level of detail. This is showing you something far more challenging. Enough of the gameplay, let's go look at the results. Battlefield 1 Ultra Detail 4 generations tested. The green bars are the average frame rates. 41 frames per second on the 670, 50 frames per second on the 770, 86 frames per second on the 970, and a whopping 134 frames per second average on the GTX 1070. This is a huge generational jump between the 770, 970, and 1070. Now, in fairness, the jump between the 670 and 770 is fairly small, but that was just a refresh. The jump to the 970 and then again to the 1070, you can see here how much performance we really gained in the past 3 generations. If you have a 3-plus-year-old graphics card, if you want better performance, yes, the newer cards really are that much faster. Now, as I said before, the game was playable on the older cards. You don't have to upgrade, but if you want the best performance, or you want to play at higher resolutions, or you want to play all the newest games at ultra detail, then yes, it is time for an upgrade. Now, the red bars and the blue bars are 1% minimum and 0.1% minimum. In short, the red bars represent the performance you'll get 99% of the time as a minimum. So we drop the bottom 1% of the frames, and that's the lowest frame rate it will drop 99% of the time. Of course, most of the time it'll be way above that. The blue bar simply takes that one decimal place further. 99.9% of the time, you will get at least that minimum. There may be 1 or 2 frames below that, but that is close to the true minimum. Now, I think the red bar is the one you should focus on. The red bar is sort of the playability number. That's the rate, that's the performance that the game will drop to during intense, heavy battle action scenes. Of course, if you watch through the playthrough, when I die, when it goes to the overhead map, when I'm just running to the enemy, for example, take the GTX 970. There were times it was over 100 frames per second. But when was it down at 60 and 67? During explosions, intense battles, when there was 10 people on the screen and a lot of stuff going on. So I think that red bar represents the bottom of the true playability. Notice that a GTX 970 maintains over 60 frames per second 99% of the time, and it maintains 60 frames per second 99.9% of the time. It's a great card for playing current games at 1080p resolution. What do you get for going to a 1070? Faster minimums, faster averages. You can see here we're nearly 100 frames per second at a 1% minimum and 80 at the 0.1%. Now the GTX 670 and 770 are way down there at 27 and 32 at the 0.1% minimums. That's because we're at ultra detail. That's because we're trying to use more VRAM than these cards have. Turn the detail down to medium or high and the bottom 2 cards will improve tremendously. Now, I did not test 1440p resolution, but first of all, the 670 and 770 are not 1440p cards. Don't even bother, at least not on a game like this. Now, a GTX 970 will do it, but not at ultra detail, at least not at this performance. Medium to high 1440p, GTX 970 is just fine. 1070, ultra detail 1440p, not a problem, nearly 100 frames per second average. It'll play wonderfully. In fact, in this game, 4K at high detail is playable on a GTX 1070. Now, really a 1080 would be a better choice, but it is playable at 4K resolution. I hope this video was helpful and useful to you. Click that like button, share this video with your friends. Remember to subscribe to my channel. Check the video description for links to everything in this video. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. Links down in the description below if you are able to. If not, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting is also appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.